I have my degree is an ocean transportation, minor in oil from Kings Point Merchant Academy. And what we were taught at the academy was that civilization runs on energy. And when Biden made energy so expensive and weaponized the dollar, this is all in less than 4 years. He basically screwed the world and he's screwing America on top of it. Why is this guy doing this stuff?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, and I'm going to answer that. But I think it's very important to understand one quick thing before I answer that question. And I'll tell you why I think he's doing it. If you look at his number one chief economic advisor, it's a man named Jared Bernstein, whose whole philosophy is relinquishing the world reserve status of the US dollar. He's the head economic advisor to the Biden administration. And in a report he wrote in 2014 called Dethrone King Dollar in the New York Times, he says that the distortions and trade imbalances created by being the world reserve currency should be relinquished immediately. So he's, you have to ask yourself, is this a coincidence? I'm not sure. But the question is, why would you do this? And I think that, boils down to me to one simple equation. According to the 2022 balance sheet of the United States government, the assets that we have are $5 trillion. That's it, $5 trillion, of which 42.3% of the assets that the United States government holds, 42%, is student debt. And on top of that, we have 151 trillion in liabilities.
Student debt went through the roof. Now it's our biggest asset. It's our biggest asset. I mean, we're bleeding the pockets of our students.
41% of the assets of the land of the free represents 41% of all the assets of this country is on the backs of our children. And that's 5 trillion in assets backing 151 trillion in liabilities. And so the question becomes, how do you pay that off?
It's not possible.
And, you made a comment earlier about it being Saudi Arabia's fault, but there was a time when they kept saying inflation was Putin's fault. But from where I come from and what I've studied in Austrian economics tells me that every time you see inflation throughout history, it's an increase in the money supply. And that's exactly what we have done over the last several years, printed more money than in the history of the country preceding it, creating these problems, these distortions. The question is, how do you ever print yourself out? How do you get out of 151 trillion in debt with 5 trillion in assets?
Andy, once again, how long is a trillion seconds?
31,688 years ago. 31,680. You got Neanderthals walking the plains of Europe a trillion seconds ago, and we are 151 trillion in debt. Yes, dollars. And so the question becomes, going back to this reset, how much of this is intended when the top economic advisor to the administration advocates this? And the two things that you could do if you wanted to lose the reserve status, the only two things you need to do: push Saudi Arabia away, weaponize the dollar, make everyone think, are we next? If we don't fall in line with what they want, are they going to take our stuff?
Wait, Andy, that's like a bank. You have a house and says, guess what? We're going to pull your loan. And suddenly said, and you're going to lose your house now. That's that's kind of the meaning of weaponizing the dollar.
And I'd like to add one other piece to that. What do people say backs the dollar's value? Forget about oil. It's the full faith and credit in the U.S. system. Well, in terms of credit, we are insolvent and broke. We're $145 trillion in the hole compared to assets versus liabilities. And in terms of faith, I'll just simply say, how many people trust this country just simply upon looking at the way justice is perhaps not equally distributed, just looking at our current and previous administration, without even going down that hole? The world notices this. And, there are a lot of people who have come to this country seeking a better life, largely because they believe that you have a justice system that looks at everyone equally and opportunities for success. And I think that really, when you talk about trust, and you talk about trust of the West versus what the BRICS are trying to do, I'll just simply say this. If Jim Rickards is right, and I believe he is, I've been saying it for 3 years, and they issue a gold-backed currency, and use the distributed ledger technology that the Chinese have mastered over 4 or 5 years with their digital yuan.
Distributed ledger technology is also known as blockchain.
That's right. So you show what every country that has signed up for the BRICS is going to peg to the blockchain. And if you do it right and have it audited by independent auditors, you now have trust. And in other words, trust is not in our past, it's not in our words, it's not in any of this. Trust in terms of the BRICS, maybe people don't trust China and Russia so much, but trust is gold and immutability of a blockchain. And if you have it independently audited, you immediately have gained a large portion of the world's trust in a system that is sorely lacking trust these days when we look westward to us.
So China's already using blockchain. The possibility or what you think is coming is the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, possibly Japan and Mexico, are going to say, we're going to shift to a gold-backed yuan. You're calling for a thing called a reset. So we heard what weaponizing a dollar kind of means. What does reset mean to you?
Well, reset means to me, look, when we realize that by raising interest rates to 5%, we put great strain on the banking system. And you can see that. And you could see if it went up just a little bit more and a little bit more, what kind of strain that would put on the system. A reset to me is an environment where a decade plus of suppressed interest rates and easy money created massive distortions in asset prices.
That's the past. That's the recent past since
correct.
2008. Right.
Correct. So we've had massive distortion in asset prices that have pushed prices stratospherically high. One should question whether or not price discovery is valid anymore, and I don't think it is in this environment. When it will be is when interest rates rise high enough. Going back to the comment of it being Putin's inflation, to me, they were looking for a villain to cast away the focus of what the Federal Reserve has done by creating so much money and suppressing interest rates and creating these distortions. To me, the villain now, by pushing Saudi Arabia away, by weaponizing the dollar, making everyone think, hey, maybe we should switch teams. Maybe they're focused on us next. They have created an environment where the rest of the world, if indeed Jim is right, and they issue a currency backed by gold, and at the same time, Saudi Arabia says, you know what, we're going to take the new BRICS currency for oil. We're no longer accepting dollars. And that's not so far-fetched. Hey, Iraq just made trading in dollars illegal, punishable by prison. And so when you talk about that possibility, remember, like you said earlier, every single country in the world for the last 50 years has had to stockpile dollars to buy oil. If that happens, and now you have a gold-backed currency that is being issued amongst the BRICS nations, and you have all of these countries joining together, which represent north of 80% of human population, not going green, and we are. And Saudi Arabia says, thanks for the memories, and they dump dollars. Why, yeah, those dollars come home hitting our shores with a tsunami of inflation. And when that inflation hits our shores, the byproduct of it is interest rates spiking. This is not something the Fed would be able to control. This would be the back end of the bond market going straight up, the 10-year, the 30-year, straight up. You can't have 15, 20% inflation with 5% interest rates. In other words, it is an event that would trigger massive inflation and massive spike in interest rates, which is inversely correlated to everything in this country that makes people feel wealthy, stocks, bonds, and real estate. And the best part about it is now you have a villain to point to. Putin, Xi Jinping, and OPEC. And much like calling inflation Putin's inflation, this would be Putin's destruction of the system. They
win.
They win. The West wins. Now everything resets. And at the same time, the banks would collapse because you have interest rates going to the moon. The banks would collapse. And isn't it interesting that the number 2 advisor to the president is Lael Brainerd, whose whole premise is removal of the banks completely and totally, and all commercial bank accounts transferred to the Federal Reserve in a central bank digital currency. She's a modern monetary theorist. So your top two advisors, one gets rid of the banks, one gets rid of the reserve currency. Is it coincidence? I don't know.